In the foothills of the Himalayas, a small hill kingdom once fought the most powerful empire on Earth to a standstill. The empire was so impressed it didn't just retreat, it recruited its enemies. This is the origin story of the Gurkhas, and it begins 2 centuries before they ever wore a British uniform. Before there was a unified Nepal, this region was a patchwork of small competing hill kingdoms. Dozens of tiny states, each with its own ruler, often at war with their neighbors over mountain passes and river valleys. One of the smallest of these was a kingdom called Gorkha, little more than a fortress town on a ridge. In the mid-1700s, Gorkha's young ruler, Prithvi Narayan Shah, set out to change that entirely. Over the following decades, he waged a long campaign to bring the surrounding hill states under Gorkha's control. Kingdom by kingdom, valley by valley, the map of the region began to change. By the time the unification was largely complete, a new kingdom had emerged, Nepal, in roughly the borders it holds today. This new kingdom was not just larger, it was militarily formidable, built on decades of hard-won mountain warfare. To the south, another power was expanding just as aggressively, the British East India Company. The company already controlled vast stretches of India, and its ambitions kept pushing further into the surrounding hills. By the early 1800s, Nepal's southern border and the company's northern ambitions were on a direct collision course. In 1814, that collision became a war. The British called it the Gurkha War. History remembers it as the Anglo-Nepalese War. The British force was vastly larger, tens of thousands of troops, backed by dozens of cannons, advancing on multiple fronts. The Nepalese defenders numbered a fraction of that, and had none of the same modern firepower. What they had instead was terrain they knew intimately, and a reputation for standing their ground that stunned their opponents. At a small hill fort called Nalapani, a Nepalese garrison held out for weeks against a much larger British force. When the defenders finally withdrew, even their opponents reportedly described their resistance with genuine respect. That pattern repeated across the war. Fortresses changed hands only after brutal, prolonged sieges. Some Nepalese positions held out far longer than the British commanders had expected going in. After roughly 2 years of fighting, both exhausted sides were ready for peace. In 1816, the 2 sides signed the Sugauli Treaty, ending the war and redrawing Nepal's borders. Nepal lost roughly 1/3 of its territory under the treaty's terms, a hard and lasting cost of the war. But the treaty also contained a clause that would shape the next 2 centuries far more than any lost territory. Nepalese soldiers, it stated, could now serve in the East India Company's own army. The first Gurkha regiment, the Nasiri Regiment, was raised that same year, in 1816. Former enemies had become, almost overnight, soldiers in the very army they had just fought against. It was an unusual arrangement, but one both sides found they could genuinely trust. Within a decade, Gurkha troops were already fighting under British command, thousands of kilometers from the hills where they'd been recruited. Their recruiting grounds stayed rooted in a handful of hill communities, the same regions that had defended those mountain forts. Over time, Gurkha stopped meaning simply a soldier from Gorkha and came to represent an entire military tradition. A tradition built on a war that, on paper, Nepal technically lost. But what began as defeat became the foundation of one of military history's most enduring partnerships. More than 200 years later, that partnership is still active. And it started with a single treaty clause few people today have ever read. This is where the story of the Gurkhas truly begins. In our next episode, who actually becomes a Gurkha, and why the selection process is considered one of the hardest in the world. Subscribe so you don't miss it.